Liberation and destruction go hand in hand. In fact, there's a reason why Monkey D. Luffy, notorious fruit eater, villain beater, and sun heater, has two hands, and it's so that he can wield both liberation and destruction with both fists at the same time. Just ask any slobby, Whole Cake Chateau, or Egghead Island. Oh wait, you can't because they've been destroyed. And it's looking increasingly like Elbaf is going to be the next island to experience liberation via destruction. Luffy is not a traditional force of good or evil, and we now have fictional scientific proof of that. In the SBS of volume 111, we received quite valuable insight into Luffy as a creature, as Oda was asked to break down what his satellites would look like under Vegapunk's system, which divided humanity into 6 equal aspects: good, evil, thinking, wisdom, violence, and greed. According to Dr. Vegapunk, these are the 6 aspects that come together to make up a human being, or at the very least the 6 that most accurately reflect him, because not all humans are created equally, as according to Eiichiro Oda, the 6 aspects that most reflect Luffy would be 5 Yorks and 1 Atlas. So Luffy is made up of 5 parts greed and 1 part violence, which is why his solution to everything is to punch it, because he lacks the thinking and the wisdom to find another way around it. But the most interesting thing to me is that Luffy lacks any aspect of good or evil. His moral compass isn't calibrated to the same settings as the rest of humanity, or in fact, calibrated at all. And that makes so much sense when you think about the sun god being linked to both liberation and destruction, 2 concepts that are generally linked to good and evil respectively. So let's have a wonderful example of this: Baratier. During this arc, Luffy performs a maneuver that often baffles first-time readers and watchers, as he suddenly decides to attack the floating restaurant itself, to which he receives loud criticism from both the Baratier chefs and the Krieg pirates, and for the first time in this arc, both warring factions are briefly united, and what brought them together was their disapproval of Luffy. Disapproval it's a pretty light word, because the stakes were extremely high for both factions. For the chefs, their homes and livelihood were at stake, and for the Krieg pirates, their lives were on the line, because they couldn't keep sailing on the half-sunken vessel they'd arrived on, especially after Mihawk decimated it further. So what we're looking at here is essentially life or death for both factions. So there's an awful lot of stock that people are putting into what amounts to a well-arranged pile of wood. That's Luffy's perspective, remembering that Baratier isn't his dream, and this is before that he learns that ships in the One Piece world can have spirits residing within them. Luffy sees destroying Baratier as the quickest path to peace. If Baratier is gone, then the Krieg pirates have no prize, and therefore the fighting stops. Which doesn't seem, amazingly well thought out until we get to Sanji. The person who takes this destruction as the most personal of attacks is Sanji, who yells about how he slaved away on the ship because he has an enormous debt to repay to Zeph. And Luffy's special brand of emotional intelligence is then able to identify that this ship isn't Sanji's dream, nor is it his home, it's actually his prison. Sanji feels bound to Baratier due to his debt, and he has chosen to give his freedom in repaying this debt, despite the fact that that's not what Zeph wants. And so Luffy replies, "So you're gonna die for this ship? Getting killed is no way to repay your debt. He didn't save your life so you could throw it away. Only a coward would do that," which is a very hard-hitting point that Sanji does register. And after that lands, Luffy ceases his plan to destroy the ship. One, because Pearl gets defeated by Gin, which changes the landscape of the fight, but more importantly because Luffy had now cut Sanji's binds. He had mentally liberated Sanji from the idea that he had to give his life to protect this ship, which starts an emotional journey that culminates in Sanji being free to pursue his dream of finding the All Blue. It's a very simple but perfect example of liberation and destruction being conceptually entwined. To dumb it down even further, how can you free a prisoner without destroying their binds? But to define Luffy in this moment would depend entirely on your personal perspective. If you're Sanji, Zeph, Gin, or any of the characters who understand the true meaning, then Luffy is a warrior of liberation. However, if you're one of the auxiliary characters observing without all of the context, then Luffy is a demon of destruction, which is almost certainly how both Joy Boy and Nika have been viewed in their respective acts, which is why we have 2 very different interpretations of their purpose. It's very easy to see Luffy as one or the other, and quite conflicting to see him as both. And someone who did see Luffy as a destroyer was Madame Charlie, who prophesied that he would destroy Fishman Island, a future that we're still waiting to come to fruition. However, in the meantime, the Fishman Island arc had a similar dual focus on liberation and destruction, and they're both present within the Noah, a very important vessel, as the Noah is both the symbol and mechanism of liberation of the entire Fishman race. It's the vehicle that will one day carry the entire entire civilization to go up, 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 and live under the sun on the surface. But in a very tricksy twist, this liberation becomes the cause of their destruction when Vanderdecken's abilities threaten to use the Noah to destroy all of Fishman Island. And so, Mr. Monkey D. Luffy, the modern inheritor of the Sun God, does what Sun God does best, one of two things. He says, I, Monkey Man, could liberate the Noah. No, wait, it's already liberated. In fact, too liberated. That's kind of the problem. So I guess I'll destroy it. And so Luffy begins relentlessly punching the Ark with the intention to not stop until there's nothing left. And at this time, he is being watched by almost every citizen of Fishman Island who is completely behind him. If he can destroy the Noah, the island will be saved. But if he can't do it in time, Fishman Island will be pulverized to dust. Don't give up, Straw Hat. We're not going to give in and run. We believe in you. And I don't think that a lot of people really recognize just what it took for the Fishmen to support Luffy like this. Yes, in this situation, your options are you either destroy the Noah or you die, so it seems like an easy choice. But in giving their consent to eradicate the Noah, the people of Fishman Island are also making the decision to give up on their own liberation. They are prepared to significantly delay or more than likely never reach their dreams and stay trapped on the sea floor. It's a rough situation. The Noah is the most historically significant artifact on Fishman Island, as well as the most significant for their future. But at the same time, they won't have a future unless they give up that future. So thankfully, Shirahoshi was able to cry to the Sea Kings in time and preserve that future for them by taking custody of the Noah. But it's still an example of Luffy being an agent of destruction, which isn't always a bad thing. Destruction is a very negative word, but often in One Piece, it is the key to liberation and salvation. With that said, Baratier and Fishman Island, they were examples of very good outcomes. Luffy destroyed, but the destruction was minimal, and everyone who Baratier, the Noah, or Fishman Island itself meant something to got to hold on to that meaning. But arcs don't always end that well, and some of them do make the innate fear of Nika quite understandable. Such as Skypia, which was in quite a similar situation to Baratier. This part of the world featured two factions fighting over a piece of land, the part of Jaya that shot up into the sky, with the Shandians claiming it to be their native home, whilst the Skypians argued that this vast was the domain of God. Because on a cultural note, I love that the Skypians revere Earth in the same way that most of our cultures revere the sky. For most of human history, the sky was something that was so unattainable to us, so we saw it as the domain of the gods. But to Skypians, regular old Earth was unattainable to them, so they viewed it as the opposite. However, what ended up happening on Skypia was the complete destruction of Angel Island, leaving the Skypians without their native home, forcing two cultures to end their centuries-long feud to come together in order to both prosper on the vast that was left after Enel's defeat. In this case, both civilizations were trapped by warfare, because after 400 years, there was too much history, too much pain, and very little appetite for peace after going on this all-war diet. And what it took to liberate the Skypians and the Shandians from this endless war was destruction. This is another case where freedom could not have been attained without that destructive catalyst, and this is also a case where this destruction was not directly caused by Luffy. It was of course Enel and his Arc Maxim, but Luffy isn't always directly responsible for the destructive elements of the Sun God prophecy. In fact, it's generally not his active decision to destroy things. It's more that destruction just so happens to fatefully follow Luffy wherever he goes. For example, it wasn't Luffy who chose to enact the birdcage on Dressrosa, which obliterated the majority of the island. It was implemented by Doflamingo, but only after Luffy arrived on Dressrosa. So in many ways, you can see Luffy as an omen of destruction. If he rocks up on your island, then something extremely bad is almost certainly about to happen. However, due to the fact that he's on your side, that something bad also has an element of good, which is the promise that following this inevitable destruction will be a rebirth. Much like the ancient mythology of the One Piece planet Blue Star. In the Harley text, the world is destroyed and reborn multiple times, and we're said to be heading that way again by the end of the series. In the case of Dressrosa, the benefit of leveling the island was to free everyone from the tyranny of Doflamingo. It liberated everyone who had been turned into a toy slave by Sugar's abilities, as well as everyone who had to fight in the Corridor Coliseum to make a living. And on a more individual note, it liberated Trafalgar Law from his life of revenge dedicated in Doflamingo's general direction. However, for a better example example of Luffy being an omen of destruction, I would point to Enies Lobby, or I guess the area that once was Enies Lobby. The fact that this island no longer exists has very little to do with Luffy himself. Yes, he invaded the island, but the response of the world government was to destroy it, which was caused by the fateful accident of Spandam mistakenly activating the Golden Denden Mushi, but no one at Marine Headquarters questioned it. They just carried out the order. And so they wiped 800 years of history off the face of the planet, without so much as a, why are we doing this? But it did liberate Nico Robin, not just literally, because the Straw Hats got her out of handcuffs and everything, took her away, had a good time, but it also liberated her because the very symbol of justice that had Robin convinced she did not have the right to live was destroyed before her eyes. And as much as it really wasn't his fault, Luffy was credited as being the one to destroy Enies Lobby, because I guess it's pretty embarrassing to admit that you accidentally nuked your own island. But that only reinforces the view of Nika as a destroyer. Back in the day of Joy Boy, or if there was an actual Nika in the ancient world, then they could have been subject to similar situations, present for higher levels of destruction that wasn't their fault, but they were credited for it at the time, spreading the fear of Nika as a destroyer and very much downplaying the elements of liberation. Although earlier I said that destruction isn't always a bad thing, which we've explored quite well, but in the same way that destruction isn't always bad, I should say that liberation isn't always good. This is an idea that we're currently grappling with during the Elbaf arc. At the time of this recording, Luffy has just freed Loki, and there is a big old question mark regarding whether or not that was the right or wrong thing to do. And much like everything else, I don't think it'll be an exclusively good or bad decision. It's a bit of both and everything in between, and perhaps something similar to the Impel Down example, where Luffy broke into the prison with the sole mission of liberation. He was on a quest to free his brother Ace, and along the way he became an integral leader in orchestrating one of the most disastrous events in world government history, being the mass breakout of Impel Down prisoners. Some of the prisoners escaping was objectively good. Freeing Jinbei, for example, big positive for the world. Others are a bit more of a gray area, like freeing Crocodile and Mr. One, who have previously caused and will go on to cause a fair bit more suffering on the planet. And if you're a big world government and or marine supporter, then freeing Crocodile is one of the most evil actions that has ever been taken, as he went on to found Cross Guild and is now one of the biggest threats to global stability as we know it. I personally believe that freeing Crocodile will be a net positive, but there are a lot of others that are objectively negative. Were it not for Luffy, there's no way that Blackbeard and his crew would have been able to free all of the level 6 prisoners. Blackbeard would have done his best to invade, but he would have been wiped out by Magellan, and Shiryu wouldn't have been free to find them an antidote. Also, Magellan wouldn't have been distracted by Luffy, and he might have stayed to make sure that the Blackbeard pirates actually, died. Either way, the release of the level 6 prisoners is partially Luffy's responsibility. Most of them were put there for a very good reason, and they are now free, which is a definite net negative on the world. So liberation isn't always as positive as it sounds. And it also shouldn't be ignored that on rare occasions there's very little difference between liberation and destruction. Marineford is a tragically wondersome example of this, as Luffy did manage to free Ace, but Ace died anyway. And the Marines who were victorious had their entire headquarters destroyed, all for the sake of remaining very much unliberated and still very much trapped within the world government system. With all of that said, Luffy is still the common omen here. Would Marineford have been destroyed if Luffy wasn't at the Paramount War? Yeah, probably. But the fact that he was there is another of so many instances where Luffy's very existence has been in direct correlation with the destruction of his surroundings. Meanwhile, Whole Cake Island was a lovely arc that hits all of the beats already mentioned in this video. Luffy invades the island on a mission to liberate Sanji, and along the way he becomes an omen for the destruction of Whole Cake Chateau, as well as the untold damage caused across Totterland with Big Mom's rampage. I'm not going to go through all of that because this is very physical destruction and you're all very smart and you get the point, but I want to focus on a different kind of destruction here, which was the mental deconstruction of Charlotte Katakuri. Almost the entire climax of this arc features Luffy gradually destroying Katakuri's mindset, which is all to do with building the illusion of perfection. Katakuri is a man trapped by perfection. He goes out of his way to enforce it upon himself for the sake of putting up a barrier to protect his siblings, and throughout this fight, Luffy shows Katakuri that keeping yourself captured by an idea is not the only way to inspire hope and belief in the ones you want to protect. Luffy destroys Katakuri mentally, which liberates Katakuri from the chains that he's put on himself. And it also gives him the hope that one day he and his family will be liberated from Big Mom as well. And this brand of mental liberation happens a lot in One Piece. In fact, the very first act Luffy took after leaving Fuchsia Village was to do the same to Kobe, to mentally push him until Kobe was capable of standing up to Alvida and taking control control of his own life. It took a lot of bullying, a lot of mental destruction, but we got there. And this trend of One Piece as a whole now brings us to the very uncertain future of Elbaf. Because if there was ever an island set up for liberation via destruction, it's this one. In fact, destruction is baked into Elbafian culture. This is where we learned that Nika was considered a destroyer, and the island itself is heavily based in Norse mythology, which seems to be building towards an inevitable Ragnarok event, and one that seems rather unstoppable because we're not just dealing with one sun god on this island. What we are doing, we are multi-godding on Elbaf. There's at least 2 people who can take on the sun god form and a third one who claims that he is. And there's actually a couple of good arguments in favor of the destruction of Elbaf. One is that it would force a sharp embrace of King Harold's ideals of peace by severing the legacy of war deeply ingrained in the island's history, and it would also emphasize peace because the giants are gonna need somewhere to live, and making friends with the other giant kingdoms would go a long way towards providing that. But then of course there's the One Piece factor, which is the idea that the destruction of Elbaf is such an obvious and highlighted idea that it's ripe for subversion. Or just as with most arcs so far, Luffy is gonna work his magic, tap into that inner atlas, and solve everyone's problems with a solid mixture of both destruction and liberation, ending more with the latter to convince the giants that the sun god is a force of generally good and to not be so afraid of the incoming end of the world.